Okay, hi. So my name is Elizabeth Mack. I will be reporting my second language buddy case report. So I worked with a student every Sunday instead of Saturdays for the conversation club. So about my student, let's talk about the cultural and language backgrounds. So in terms of language backgrounds, my student spoke Ukrainian, which is a Slavic language, but also spoke English. Was pretty proficient in the language. There was some aspects of where you could definitely tell that he was a English language learner. He also did discuss that he knew Russian, but did not speak the language anymore after everything between the war between Ukraine and Russia. Cultural background. So he ended up living in Sumy, Ukraine, uh, ended up going to Sumy University. We had discussed the country as a whole in terms of religious affiliation, which is Christianity. We talked about the effects that had and like the impacts that it has had on him growing up, as well as the impacts that it has had on other people in his community. Um, we also talked about the difference between how International Women's Day as well as Mother's Day is celebrated in the US compared to Ukraine. So we talked about how in the Ukraine, women are more appreciated for their beauty on International Women's Day, as well as Mother's Day, um, rather than their accomplishments that they have succeeded in. Whereas in the US, we talked about how we focus less on the beauty aspect and more of what are some empowering things that women have done that society doesn't necessarily always acknowledge, but we should be acknowledging. And we end up acknowledging on International Women's Day. We also talked about values that Ukraine has compared to the US. So we talked about education quite a bit because I am an education major, as we talked about. And my student was also interested in teaching English as a teacher. So we talked about the values of education. So in terms of values, we both discussed that we have very similar values in education. We want what's best for the students. We want a more individualized approach and much less small class approach. Um, we talked about the dislike of lack of motivation that students have. We've discussed quite a bit how younger students nowadays lack the intrinsic motivation to want to learn. They struggle quite a bit with wanting to motivate themselves to do the work. Um, we also talked about the dislike of laziness, which is a common occurrence in the Ukrainians, which they don't like laziness and they don't like lack of motivation. Um, they very much value punctuality and efficiency. So we discussed this because since he is a tutor and tutors other students in English, we talked about how the lack of motivation in some of his students is shown across the board, and it can come off as a bit frustrating for him. And we talked quite a bit about different ways that you can motivate students, which helped me understand where he was at in terms of like understanding the language of English because he went step by step of this is how I teach English to my students. And this is how I focus on important like grammar structures since the Ukraine's grammatical structure is very, very different compared to the American or English grammatical structure. So let's start getting into learners' difficulty in producing English vowels and consonants. So I noticed that there was quite a bit of incorrect like articulation when it comes to like e, like e, long long e sounds, short e sounds. Quite a bit. In the front articulation of the mouth, he ended up having quite a bit of trouble like trying to pronounce those and producing those sounds. I also realized whenever he would do any words that ended in ing, the ng sound, so like raining, ing, that sound, he had a trouble producing it. He could produce it, um, after a bit, like it took him like it would give him a moment where he would have to like take a moment, pause, think about it, and then produce it, rather than having that natural flow of fluency. Um, but overall, it wasn't that bad. Um, Some other things I noticed is some of the plosives that we have. So like p, t, and k. Um, some words he would be able to hit those plosives very, very well as like a natural, like a native English speaker would. But then there were some aspects where if it was paired with another letter, he would struggle just a little bit more. Or they would just be just a bit too soft and not as like not as aggressive. So like people, um, it might have sounded a little bit more softer and a little muffled-ish. Um, Another thing that he ended up having trouble with was the H sound, or a little bit of the H sound, and I don't know how to explain that one. But I heard it in just some of the words that he would say when he would do it. Um, Another thing I realized is rounded vowels in certain words, and just overall, rounded vowels were just something tricky for him to articulate. So, I have some examples later on that sort of go along with this, and I'll explain a bit more. But anyway, so let's go to the next one, which is learners' difficulty in word stress, intonation, and comprehension and vocabulary. So, in terms of vocabulary, his vocabulary was extensive, but very formal and like professional, but would forget some aspects of like simpler words, such as like for trying to say young girl, he would say small girl. Um, he did this quite frequently because I had to, at first, when I like he said this, I was like, when you say small girl, do you refer to it as like a height? And he's like, no, no, no. I mean like and he would do this a lot. And I'm like, do you mean like younger girl? And he said, yes, a younger girl. Someone who's like younger in age. And I was like, oh yes, a young girl. Referring to the student that he was teaching. Uh, Another thing is that if he didn't know the word in English, right off the bat, he would either ask me for like he would try to describe the word to me and I would be like okay and like I would try to help and fill in the gaps but most of the time he was relatively good at either googling the word or like putting it through a translator putting it through as a Ukrainian word um and then translating it to English and then asking me if it was the correct word to put in or if it should be a different word most of the time it was the correct word he just forgot the English word for it um, but sometimes he would explain it in his home language at first. Um, Intonation wise, it was very prominent. His intonation was very, very well. Um, but some aspects to express express politeness, he struggled just a little bit in conveying that type of like speech and intonation. Um, But also, if confusion were to occur where he didn't fully understand what message he was trying to portray, he would take a moment and like pause and or say like ums and like the fluency of the sentence wasn't as um comprehensible in a sense sometimes if it was too long of a pause. But sometimes he would say the full sentence with the intonation starting off really strong and then as he went on it slowly just went more monotoned and the intonation was lost um but overall his intonation is pretty good for someone who is practicing English actively. um Another thing I do want to talk about is his comprehension skills. His comprehension skills are immaculate. If he didn't understand a word I said, he would ask for a rough translation, or a rough definition of what that word meant, and was genuinely curious in understanding new words, what their vocabulary was, what the implication was in a sentence. And we talked about this quite a bit as well, especially when it was like more complex words. Um, I think I used the word pedagogy one time, and we had a whole discussion about it because he was like, I never knew what the English word was for it. And we talked about it for a bit and we talked about language overall. So, another aspect that I want to hit on is the fact that learners difficulty in oral communication and having examples. So I have quite a bit of examples that I picked up from him. So what I knew in his oral communication difficulties is that when he didn't know what to say or how to word something, a lot of or like long pauses would occur, which is fine because that happens even in native like English speakers. That's completely fine. It was just a lot more frequent. Or in midst of sentences, it would be so this thing um it would be like a processing moment, and it's just one of those things that you it works on based on like fluency, which is fine. If he didn't know how to pronounce a certain word, he would either run it through his translator, like I said, or he would ask me how to pronounce the word. He would do his best, and I would ask for clarification beforehand and be like, "Oh, is this the word you meant?" So I had a clear understanding, and he had a clear understanding of what he was working with. Um, Oh, another thing that occurred quite frequently was whenever he would say that, the TH sound, which is not something that occurs in his home language, would say zat. So he would use the Z sound. He would say zat over there. Another thing he struggled with was articles. Lots of articles were missing in oral communication. So, for example, he said, I have online class. Um, Completely misregarding like I have an online class. Um, Another one was teacher was not good, boring. So he meant to say the teacher was not good, but more boring. So some of the articles, conjunctions even, or some of the things that he was missing, but you can't really like fault him for it because it's one of those things that you just pick up naturally as you're like learning the language. Um, One of the other things was instead of like the I, me, my's, like anything referring to himself, one point he was like, oh, he forgot to say like I remember celebrating on the 7th of January, um, and connected it to the Russian New Year. And he said New Year in a way I'll explain in a minute, but he said, remember me celebrating on the 7th of January. What he meant to say, I remember celebrating on the 7th of January, or I think that was what he meant. But then when he said Russian New Year, instead of having that AR-ish sound implication, it sounded more like year, like more of a long E and more emphasis on a hard ER at the end. Um, the student also struggled quite a bit with past tense. So instead of like saying like, oh, they gave us something, the student said they give us a book, or they give us the worksheets, or it the past tense and future tense was something he also struggled with. So like saying like will be doing or anything ending with ing was just something he struggled with. Um, but sometimes he would say it in the correct manner. As well as like certain aspects, he would get the complete like past correctly. Um, but he'd be talking about the present. So it was just one of those things. I feel like that time order is a bit tricky for some of it, since I know that there's a loose word order and like it's the grammatical structure of the sentence in itself is a bit different. Um, he also struggled with plurals on the ends of words. So instead of saying following different calendars, he said follow different calendar. Um, he didn't mean just one. We were talking about the New Year and how the Ukrainians used to follow a different calendar and that they now follow two calendars for two different holidays and stuff like that. So it was just one of those things that I noticed that he lacked a lot in ends of plurals on his sentences. When talking about like notes, he'd be like, "Oh, I noted down," or the note that I wrote for my students. And I'm like, oh, is it just one note? And he'd be like, no, it's like all these notes. And I'm like, okay. Um, yeah. So another thing I wanted to talk about was the impact of the learner's home language on English sounds and speech. We've talked about it just a little bit, especially within terms of like difficulties in oral communication, but as well as like the stress and intonation and vocabulary. But in terms of his home language, the fact that they have loose word order structure definitely plays a part in understanding the impact that it has on him learning English. The absence of articles can make sentences a bit unclear when he's discussing things. But sometimes he'll catch himself and fix the sentence before I can even consider like saying anything, or he'd notice it and he'd be like, "Oh, let me say that again," and would say it again. Um, I do know that his home language is gendered, whereas English it's not gendered. Like certain words don't have like the ah or o if we're talking like Spanish or like French, same thing. I know that it is just it's grammatically gendered, but I don't remember the exact for Ukraine. I know their adjectives agree with nouns in case, number, and gender. But English, it's not like that at all. They only have one form of participle, whereas English has two. Um, the TH sound is not a sound that is produced in his home language. So I understand why he has a difficult time trying to produce that sound. Um, and then the impact of certain spelling orders that English words have will impact the ability of the student to pronounce certain words. So like that, zat, the other word? I can't think of it off the top of my head. He said something and I forgot what I didn't write it down. Um, but I know that certain spellings I can tell, especially with just HA. The student struggled so much with pronouncing those types of words that had that like that spelling order. Certain spelling order just would mess up the pronunciation the student would be trying to do. And we talked about it quite a bit as well. Um, So, in terms of possible instructional strategies to overcome differences, I took this more as since he is an older student, um, he definitely is a bit more self-motivated to do this instead of being in a school. So I said that he should practice a lot more with English speakers and not being afraid of them correcting their grammar or even just like working on their correct pronunciation about certain things. Like having that open line of communication where we know it's not coming from like any harm and that this is actually something that's like going to benefit the student learning English. Um, Working on tongue placement and sound placement through recording themselves and comparing it. So I found when I was doing, I'm going to compare this to American Sign Language as well as like Spanish because I do practice my spoken Spanish, which is not the best. But I practiced like ASL when I was learning it. Um, so when I was learning American Sign Language, the best way for me to reflect on how my skills were progressing, as well as my grammatical and fluency, was recording myself, watching the video, and then practicing. If I didn't like the fluency, I would do it again and again. I would try different sentences. I would record myself having conversations with myself. I would literally be like, person one, hi, what's your name? Person two, my name is Liz, and like going through and like switching between the like order and like having that like recording and like seeing the difference helped me quite a bit in like fixing my grammatical structure, my fluency. So same thing with Spanish is I would record myself speaking in Spanish any like random words, grammatical sentences that I had learned from anything I read online. Practicing and recording myself and listening to myself say the language it just helped me understand where I was going wrong and like where my faults were going wrong. So I thought that would be such a great way for the student to understand, um, to correct themselves and overcome certain difficulties they may have. Um, Another thing I also said would be a great thing is exposing themselves to English through different forms of media outside of an educational environment to understand formal and informal language. So I said using podcasts, movies, songs, books, and conversations, and paying attention how the sounds are produced. Um, so when I was learning Spanish for quite a bit, I would have all my Spanish music, being paying attention to the lyrics, seeing how they pronounced. I would listen to Spanish podcasts, Spanish videos. All of my shows were in Spanish, movies were in Spanish, everything. Classic movies that I had seen in English many, many times, I would watch them in Spanish. Childhood movies in Spanish, Cars movie in Spanish, Shrek movie, Spanish. Like having that overall like exposure to language is something that just helps you develop that proficiency, develops, okay, this is what it should sound like in different contexts and different types of like pitches, accents, intonations, stress. You hear it as you're listening to those things. It's subconscious sometimes, but you want to actively make that a conscious decision that you are listening to. um Another thing that I said would be a good thing would be getting feedback from a native or proficient speakers. I know my student is a very proficient speaker, but it doesn't hurt to have more conversations with other proficient speakers or even native speakers of English. Um, Being able to use tools such as like dictionaries, phonetic charts, recordings, and apps would help a lot. Keeping track of this is something that I found difficult to pronounce, or this is my like pronunciation of this is a bit different than a native speaker or another proficient speaker. How can I change this? Let me record some stuff. But another thing I said is just to be patient and persistent. Learning is a very slow process. It's a very time consuming process and it takes a lot of effort to do. So it's just one of those things. It's going to take time. You need to have the patience in order to like overcome difficulties. You have to have patience with yourself before you can consider like learning another language. You have to have the patience of, you have to have understanding of, if I fail, like I'm going to fail. Like I'm learning a language, I'm going to fail at almost every aspect. But if I keep pushing through and being very persistent and persevering, you will get so many good benefits out of it that you will be proud of yourself at the end. Like you will always be wanting to learn more. You'll have these conversations. People will be impressed with you. Like just being okay and patient with yourself is something that I find very, very helpful. Remembering that phonetic skills can be learned and improved with time is also another very, very important thing. Other observations that caught my attention during the sessions. So a lot of the time, so I speak with my body all the time. I speak with my hands quite a bit. I know at the end it wasn't as much, but and you can't really see it in frame, but I talk a lot with my hands. And so did the student, the Ukrainian student. He spoke with his hands quite a bit. Would motion to snap if he forgot a word, he'd be like, and he would like do motions to try to like jog that memory, which is what like any English learner would do. Anyone would like if most people like when they're trying to remember, they're like, they're like trying to snap it back. It makes sense, like that body language. But he also used body language to portray his message, conveying his message. And I think that was such an important aspect to focus on, because it shows you that kinesthetic learning is just one of those things that really help us as individuals. Like maybe like you remember one time you were doing a certain like movement and oh my gosh, you do that movement and you remember the word, or like having like little things like that could help you. Um, Me and my student had also discussed quite a bit. I'm just going to talk about this observation my thing. Um, he was very interested in the difference of education values and education systems in terms of America versus Ukrainian education systems. We also talked about different motivation styles since he knew I was in a classroom, and we talked quite a bit about my students and how I kept my students motivated to learn, since especially since they were young students. It's like, how do you keep them wanting to learn more? How do you motivate your students? And I said, honestly, it's such an individual approach that it's hard. You can try some and it might work for maybe half the class. The other half of the class is not engaged. It's very trial and error. Trying to keep motivation high is just one of those things that you work on as an educator. We talked quite a bit about his one student who was lacking motivation. And he's like, I don't know how to get her to do her homework. And I said, well, how about this? Why don't you set time at the end of the session to do so? Like, give her that time, give her that aspect of like practice with you, practice by herself, but while still being there. So she doesn't feel as stressed to do it at home, or doesn't feel as bad when she doesn't come in and doesn't have it done. And it's frustrating for you and it's frustrating for her that she's lacking this motivation, this laziness that she has. And we talked about the values of being efficient and not being lazy. Um, it was just one of those things in the observation. Like I realized how curious as learners we are. Um, that English practicing is just one of those things that you have to be curious about everything and anything to obtain more like vocabulary. He was sucking up any of like the bigger like vocabulary that I was using. He'd be like, "Oh, what does that word mean?" I like just the intrinsic curiosity that this friend had was so amazing. It's very inspiring. Anyways, that is my case buddy report. I really hope you enjoyed. I know I rambled quite a bit, um, but I love this experience and I wish I could have more experiences talking to other students outside of the US. I wish I could talk to more. I am so intrigued to understand the impacts that home languages have for students to produce English. Anyway, thank you for listening. Have a lovely day.